Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very special event on managing the nation's cyber risk. My name is Kimberly Martin. I'm a professor at Barnard College here at Columbia, and I'm also a faculty member at the Arnold Saltzman Institute for War and Peace Studies at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and I'm welcoming you here today on behalf of the Saltzman Institute and SIPA. And before we get to the main event, I'm now going to turn things over to a surprise guest that we have here today, and that surprise guest is Jeff Moss, who is proud to be a hacker. He is the founder of both Black Hand and DEF CON, the two big hacker conferences. He has been in the past the chief security officer of ICANN, the nonprofit organization that assigns internet domains, and he was working for them at the time that Anonymous was threatening to take down the entire internet system. He also was named in 2012 by Janet Napolitano, who was then the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, to the Homeland Security Advisory Council. He's now a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on Cybersecurity, and he does a lot of risk management and risk analysis for private corporations. So I'm going to turn things over to Jeff.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this discussion between Jay and the Deputy Secretary. And so I'm just going to introduce them so you have a little bit of context where they're coming from. Deputy Secretary Mayorkas graduated from UC Berkeley on the left coast. And Jay wants me to point out it's another fine university. So he was nominated by President Clinton to be a U.S. attorney, and it turned out he was the youngest in the nation at the time, and served as the vice chair for the Attorney General's Advisory Subcommittee on Civil Rights. In subsequent private practice, he was named as one of the 50 most influential minority lawyers in America. He worked for the Department of Homeland Security and was the director of the USCIS, or the Homeland Security United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which operates the largest immigration system in the world. And finally, he was named the Deputy Secretary for DHS, where he's been focusing some of his time on cyber policy issues, recently evidenced by a new tasking that HSAC has on coming up with a conclusion to the United States National Cyber Incident Response Framework. So these national and global issues of cybersecurity have been on his plate for some time. And finally, Jay, who will be doing the grilling here. Jason Healey, who's also known mostly for his policy work. I came across Jay in his policy work in D.C., including a policy director at the White House and director of the Cyber Statescraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, which is one of the top think tanks focusing on cyber issues. But the interesting part with Jay is he worked at Goldman Sachs doing incident response, and so he has some hands-on experience actually chasing bad guys and trying to respond to their attacks. And so the Deputy Secretary came out and spoke at DEF CON this year, so that was 2015. Jay first came in 2001. So he's a bit of a pioneer in recognizing the value of mingling with some shady types in Vegas and seeing what the trends are, like what the bad guys are up to, and the good guys. And so now Jay is the senior research scholar here at the Saltzman Institute for Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jay, and we're going to kick this off. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Fantastic. Thanks for all joining. Thanks so much for coming and making Columbia University part of your trip to New York.
Thank you.
And as we had a chance to talk a little bit before. Now I understand that you came up to New York. You had a citizenship event where you were swearing people in, and we heard in your bio that you come in through the lawyer and. Now, you spent time in the San Francisco Bay Area, near Silicon Valley, but I'm really curious. One of our roles as a university is to take young people, and sometimes not so young, and train them, educate them into a new area. Now, so you're coming into, you hadn't done cyber before, I think. So I'm really interested in how you made that transition from coming in, having such a strong legal background, and now you're one of the top officials in the United States responsible for cyber.
So My role as a deputy secretary is a very significant management role. In cyber, however, we tackle very significant policy issues and operational issues. And I think the transition from a federal prosecutor to working in a civilian department, specifically in the cyber world, is a difficult transition, and a transition that is very relevant and reflective of the tensions that exist within the government in addressing the cyber challenges. And let me share with you specifically what I mean. When I was a federal prosecutor, my focus was, of course, on making the case, putting together the evidence, and achieving an individual or an entity's accountability. And that was of primary importance. In the cyber area, a number of federal agencies, some within the Department of Homeland Security, the United States Secret Service, for example, but of course the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, in the Department of Justice, has a similar orientation to achieve accountability for a cyber attack. And that is of primary importance from an investigative and enforcement perspective. But the question arises whether accountability, the investigation and enforcement, should be of primary importance, or whether remediation, whether assisting a victim in addressing the harm, patching the attack, and preventing the attack in the future should be of primary importance and achieve a greater public good. And so in this space, there is a tension between the enforcement, the process of holding an individual or entity accountable for the attack, and assisting the victim in the remedial capacity, and assisting the broader private sector. And that tension is playing out, quite frankly, in Congress right now, as Congress considers the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act.
And I'd like to cover some administrative points. So we'll be going until 10:30 today. So we'll do the Q&A with the Deputy Secretary for 30, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to questions, and we'll have a few people that'll have the hand mics, and we'll bring the hand mics around for the questions and answers. I want to thank Kim and Jeff for the introductions. Also, we are live streaming this right now on in partnership with the Christian Science Monitor's passcode cybersecurity section. So a lot of times my students will ask me what they need to do to learn more about cybersecurity, and the passcode section of Christian Science Monitor is one of the places where a lot of good journalism on the field is coming together, so thanks to them. They're also live tweeting this using the hashtag CyberSIPA, Cyber S-I-P-A. So this is a public on the record event, so please feel free to tweet it as we go. And in case you want to know, Jeff's hashtag is in fact the dark tangent. I would have taken it, but he already had it. So I like this thought on tensions where you left us there, because that's just one of the tensions. Do we want to arrest the bad guys, or do we want to stop the attack? But we have other tensions too. I mean, I'm sure that in the public policy process in D.C., there's also the tensions on whether we want to secure the internet, or do we want to secure it enough so that we can't use it for our own purposes, for Department of Defense and in the intelligence community. I mean, this year out at Black Hat, one of the conferences that Jeff had created, one of the speakers talked about this military mindset of supremacy of cyberspace, that security for me but not for thee, Jennifer Granick put it. And so this has to be a tough tension when you're in the White House in these deputies committee meetings. And I'm curious, as a public policy, how do we work through that? When you've got these tensions, whether in DHS or across the government, how do we work through resolving those issues?
So it's a process, and Can I take a step back for a second, if I may, just to say something about Jeff Moss, who was kind enough to introduce us, both an extraordinary visionary in this area, and we in the Department of Homeland Security are really fortunate to be able to tap somebody like Jeff as an advisor in the cyber space. And I will tell you, I spoke at the two conferences that were referenced, Black Hat and DEF CON, and they're hacker conferences, and it was my first exposure to the hacker world, and it's fascinating. And there's a process of spot the Fed at DEF CON, which, as you can see, would not have been difficult for anybody. But there is, all hackers are not the same, and all hackers are not equal, and there is something called the ethical hacker, of which Jeff is one, and it's just a fascinating world where an individual will, for example, hack into a system that a company owns and then share that exposure with the company to assist the company in better equipping and securing itself. And it's just a very fascinating dynamic. So we, the deputies, the principals, the cabinet members, people within the government sit around the table, figuratively speaking, and sometimes, of course, literally, and hash these issues out. And we do so critically in a public-private partnership as well. These are the we engage with policy leaders such as yourself because this is an area. Well, usually the government does not have a monopoly on good ideas. This is an area where that is quite acutely so. And because there are such, there are government interests at stake, but there are broader societal interests at stake as well, and achieving a balance, if in fact that is what is desired, requires a very robust public discourse. And those tensions in the cyberspace are real, and I can give you two examples, if I can. The Sony, the attack on Sony. How should let's assume that the government is able to attribute that to a state actor. What is the appropriate response? Is there a response on the part of the government to that or not? And what are the consequences or ramifications should we answer that question affirmatively? And so people at Sony are significantly displaced. The company itself is harmed. How do we respond because it's a cyber attack? Somebody posed a question when we were sitting around the table discussing this issue. What if the attack had been that the Sony building at an unoccupied time of the evening had been firebombed and destroyed? That probably, and it was a kinetic strike, well, that would probably potentially be a simpler answer. But is this the cyber analog of that? And I think the rules of engagement are not very clearly defined. That's an example of a difficult policy issue. Another difficult policy issue, and one that was front and center when I spoke at both Black Hat and DEF CON, those conferences, was the following: the encryption, the encryption debate. So Apple has designed its phone so that the owner of the phone is the sole point of access to the information on that device. And we in the government cannot access that information even with a warrant. We would have to serve the warrant on the individual who holds the device. And the encryption, the state of encryption now is not sudden. It's been evolving over time. There's been a greater and greater movement towards greater and greater encryption, and people consider it a very significant step in protecting not just the security of the internet, but also one's privacy interests. In the government, in the Department of Homeland Security, in the intelligence community, we see an individual in Syria communicating with an individual here in the United States and talking about the plotting of a terrorist act. And all of a sudden, we're able to observe those communications, and then those communications go dark on us. We lose the ability to access the communication, and we are quite concerned about the fact that the plotting was evolving, was developing, and we've lost our ability to track it. And we've lost our ability because of end-to-end encryption. And so there's a tension between our investigative capabilities and the very legitimate and critical interests in a greater encryption. How we solve that tension, how we resolve it, is, I think, an unanswered issue.
But, I mean, should it still be unanswered? I mean, we are the first presidential directive on critical infrastructure protection was 1998. So we're a fair amount into this. You know, the National Cyber Strategy was 2003 under President Bush. And so it seems a lot of times when you've got competing public goods,
yes,
like you're talking about, and you have a tension between competing public goods, you have a presidential strategy or something else that says, when it comes down to it, we're going to have, here's how you decide between these two things. Here's my priority as president, or here's our agreed to priorities with Congress on how we're going to decide between these two. And I'm still a bit flummoxed that we're so far in to this conversation in DC, and yet we don't have a national strategy, a single national strategy for cyber, and a single national strategy that gives some guidance down into the departments for them to look at that.
So I think that's fair to some extent. I would say the following. Number one, I think we're more mature now than we were yesterday, and we're perhaps not as mature as we need to be. Mm-hmm. Number one. Number two, in this area, the resolution of policy issues is not, I don't think, should be static. Mm-hmm. In other words, you know what, we've resolved this policy question, we can put this policy issue to rest, let's move on. I think tomorrow developments will occur that will require us to revisit the policy and revise it. Yeah. It's a very dynamic landscape.
And this is one place where I don't think this administration has gotten as much credit, and there has been. So I mean, for me, the priority is defense needs to get better than offense. And so to me, if you have this tension, that's one of the ways that you can decide between these public goods. And I've been very pleased with this White House that they've done two public policy defaults. And I think it's a really interesting place. I'd love your thoughts. One in saying, if we get information that an American company has been owned, that we will tell them. That's not saying we're going to tell them every time, but if we've got signals intelligence or law enforcement sensitive data, we will still try and tell that company. And I think that's such an important default. And the other one is if we get to know through, say, signals intelligence, a new vulnerability that isn't known, a 0-day, our default is to tell the vendor. And I don't think the administration has gotten as much credit for those public policy defaults. So I'm looking to get your thoughts on that. And are there any other of these public policy default switches that we can just go from no to yes that might help buy us even more cybersecurity to manage the nation's cyber risk?
So let me take those in order. So I appreciate the recognition of what this administration has done with respect to those policy defaults. I would put it under the rubric or the title of information sharing. The policy decision of this administration has been that the sharing of information in the cyber threat world is the key to a greater level of cybersecurity and a more secure cyber ecosystem across the nation. So I think that has been really the mantra, and we've been marching to that consistently, number one. Can we go from a no to yes? There is cybersecurity legislation pending in Congress now that I think includes some no's to yes. So, for example, greater liability protection for companies if they share information with the government. Right now, it's a bit of a murky area. I think some companies are hesitant to share information with the government by virtue of their liability exposure for turning over to the government personally identifiable information in which people have a vested privacy interest. This legislation which the administration supports in a particular form, would give greater liability protection. That's not a no to a yes, but a murky to a clear.
What will you do when you have the information? I mean, so this is managing the nation's cyber risk.
Yes.
So the information comes into the government, comes into DHS or Department of Justice, or I guess if it's maybe into DoD in some cases. How then will you manage the nation's cyber risk with this information that comes in versus how Symantec might use that same information or CrowdStrike? Right.
So a security firm will use that information to protect the cybersecurity of its client. We have a different client. Our client is the public. Okay, the nation, if you will. So we will get information from a particular, and by the way, we are advocating, and the administration is advocating, that the Department of Homeland Security be the primary portal for the receipt of that information, because we're a civilian agency. And what we would do is share that information within the government in automated form in near real time, and I say near real time so that we could scrub it to ensure that the privacy interests are protected. We have a statutorily created Office of Privacy and a statutorily created Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. So we would receive the information from Company A. And then what we would do is we would, in automated form, and we are building this capability, we would share that information without exposing the personally identifiable information of individuals. We would broadcast that information publicly so that while Company A was penetrated in a cyber attack, we can share information so that companies B, C, D, and so on can defend themselves, can build the defenses so that they don't suffer the same attack by the same actor in the same way. And so by disseminating information about particular attacks, we can create a greater defense system more broadly. That's the model.
And if I can, I'd like to pull you back to Sony for a bit.
Yeah.
One of the truisms that we've heard about cyber incidents and cyber conflict is attribution is so difficult. As a matter of fact, it underpins so much of the Chinese position is, what is this weird arcane science that the Americans have that they can be sure of who's doing these attacks? Don't you know that attribution for cyber incidents is so difficult? Now, in the context of Sony, we seem pretty sure. Now, I don't want to get necessarily into the evidence unless you'd like to, but can you talk about that for the role of DHS? How important is attribution and knowing who's responsible? I think that gets back to the initial tensions of the enforcement versus stopping. And are we getting better at knowing who it is that's responsible?
So I would say, I would probably broaden it a little bit, if I may, Jay, and say not specific to DHS, but for the government. The government has the ability to attribute attacks to actors, to state actors or otherwise. It's a challenging process. Our capabilities are growing. We are really, we have extraordinary talent in the government, and you know this better than do I, having been one of those talents. And it's important from a number of perspectives. Number one, understanding the actor helps build a more capable defense. One understands characteristics. I mean, actors have personalities, or I think means of operation, methods of operation, if you will, number one. And number two, it informs what the response should be. And of course, what the response should be is in and of itself quite a policy discussion.
Yeah, and I've always thought when it comes to, especially when we're looking at public policy in cyber conflict, not necessarily something that was probably a criminal event, but something that has a national security context, I even try and get away from the word attribution, because that implies, I think, the wrong thing. I always prefer national responsibility, because attribution can let the other side off the hook too much. National responsibility, I think, can help keep the nation really on. I've always thought when it came to Sony, if you don't mind me staying on that for a second, because a lot of my colleagues felt like, why is even President Obama talking about this? Why are we making this are we now saying that this motion picture studio is now part of the nation's critical infrastructure? And I never saw it like that. I always saw it as this was a successful attack by another nation on American free speech. And that regardless of whether the nation's critical infrastructure, that has to be something that the president talks about. I mean, we can't allow that to pass.
I couldn't agree more. I think if an actor attacks a company for a financial gain, that's one thing, and the analysis of how to respond is informed accordingly. If a state attacks a company to harm a greater interest, this was not a pecuniary interest, but rather a foundational interest, a constitutional interest, the response protocol and the analysis is different. And yes, the president needs to speak in defense of one of our greatest liberties.
Yeah, great. And I've got plenty of other questions. This is just a really interesting conversation so far. But I'm happy to start opening it up. And so if you have got a question, please go ahead and get my attention anytime, and then I'll go ahead and call on you, but I'll continue the questions as we go. Is that okay? Great. Who's running mics? Patrick and Aristu are going to run mics. And here on the stage left. Hi, and can you say your name and then the question?
Sure. My name is Natasha Cohen. I'm a student here at SIPA. And earlier you spoke about the prospects for public-private partnerships in creating successful cyber policy. I'm wondering if you can also talk about the prospects for public social partnerships, that is the combination of NGOs or nonprofits working with public and private institutions to create a successful cyber policy.
And I just want to note that the question successfully ended with a question mark, and was brief, and there was only one of them. So let's follow Natasha's lead in future questions, about which I will be a bear. Thank you.
So we are very engaged with the NGO and the academic community in the development of policy. I think that we've learned a great deal in the last year. I think in one particular area with respect to the chronology of that dialogue and that collaboration. And let me give you the example of which to which I refer. The Wassenaar Agreement is an international agreement that was really designed to have all countries really control the proliferation of technology and research and knowledge in the cyber area, so that it is not manipulated by bad actors to suppress human liberties and freedoms and the like. And we in the federal government promulgated a notice of proposed rulemaking, a proposed rule to implement the Wassenaar Agreement. And what we learned in response from the public, including very critically academic institutions and NGOs, was that in our effort to ensure that bad actors didn't receive the benefits of technological and knowledge advancement, we shut out good actors or suffocated good actors as well. And so we're taking a step back, and I heard this from Jeff and others at Black Hat. We really need to rethink the contours of that agreement and the agreement, quite frankly, fundamentally. We probably would have been better off had we engaged more robustly before we even issued a proposed rule for public comment, because the proposed rule and the consequences thereafter have created a bit of a chilling effect that as long as Wassenaar is out there as a possibility, people are very concerned about its consequences. And we need to clear the air, and we need to clear commerce, and we need to clear the space for the good actors. And I learned that most acutely in speaking with Jeff and others around the table at Black Hat. And so that dialogue, I think, does occur. I think we need to advance its chronology to at the very beginning of our contemplated actions.
And that's such I mean, how can we institutionalize that? I mean, we've got the Homeland Security Advisory Committee, we've got the NSTAC, National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee. I mean, this can be difficult for governments to try and institutionalize that process because of the concern of you know, getting improper advice that's akin to lobbying. You know, in DC we call it, you know, FACA rules and things like that. How might we try and institutionalize that?
So I can. So it's really. I think it's a very fundamental, developing a fundamental quality of government, which is governing by engagement. And I will tell you, just from the immigration agency that I used to lead, we created an Office of Public Engagement, and I did so because I started to read some of our policies in the immigration agency, and they were not responsive to the needs of the communities that we were actually entrusted to serve. And we don't have a monopoly on good ideas. And so what we decided to do was develop a culture, truly a culture, of engaging with the public on a policy issue, hearing from them, then drafting a policy, and then putting the policy of whatever importance it was, sharing the policy for public comment. That and rather than just promulgating policies and hoping we hit the mark, and getting that public comment, creating that culture is I think, a very critically needed attribute of government writ large. There's certain areas, of course, where that isn't appropriate. In certain intelligence, national security contexts, or what have you. But I think it comes with time, and it comes with dedication of doing so.
Now, so DoD has been saying some of the same things. I mean, we want to increase our engagement with the technology community more generally, not just to improve their own cybersecurity, but include, for example, their acquisition. But they're looking to even create offices out in San Francisco, so that they can facilitate that transition. How does that work for? How's the thinking in that within Homeland Security?
So the Department of Homeland Security, and specifically the area of our department that is focused on research and development, as well as cyber, is opening a Silicon Valley office for that purpose and others. For the purpose of engagement, for the purpose of research and development, but also critically for the recruitment of talent.
Yeah. And I know as part of that process of coming out and hearing, that's why you're here today, and that's one reason why you don't give prepared remarks. You want it as a conversation.
Yes,
and
I will tell you, we have a challenge. because you know, if I stepped into this room and I said, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you, there would probably be, at least among some, a bit of skepticism.
They were hoping you're offering jobs. They'd
yeah,
be like, all right,
yeah.
where do I get my resume? I'll give it to Jeanette.
That would be great too, by the way. I think it's
We'll definitely come to that before we close.
But I think we have some work to do in rebuilding trust of the private sector in a post-Snowden area. I have to tell you, I see that in the international arena very significantly. When I travel and I speak with our counterparts in Germany or elsewhere, the Snowden revelations have certainly impacted the dialogue and the resolution of critical policy issues. And so we have to rebuild that trust.
And this is why I love doing these Q&As with someone that's this senior, because if we were just talking to a mere SES and DHS, they couldn't actually say the name Snowden. And so when you're actually doing, you know, they'd say like, due to recent, you know, unpleasantries, and he who shall not be named. Okay, I got a question from Sean Lonergan there. Oh, one second, please wait for the mic so that our friends at Passcode, the Christian Science Monitor, can get that.
Thank you. Sir, Sean Lonergan, I'm a PhD candidate here at Columbia and instructor at West Point. With what you're saying with attribution is very impressive, the fact the United States government has been able to overcome a lot of those challenges. And I'm really curious, now that we can successfully attribute to a higher degree than we could before, what do you think is an appropriate response for the United States to basically punish non-state actors that are conducting illicit activities against U.S. interest? Is it something technical, such as like an active defense, like hacking back, or is it something more diplomatic?
Thanks, Sean.
Non-state. A non-state actor?
Like patriotic hackers or cyber terrorists, perhaps, activists?
So I think it's a very, I don't think the answer is well defined yet. I think this is a rapidly evolving landscape, and I think it's a very case-specific inquiry. And so the question is, let's say the notion of a counterattack was raised. I don't know if you want to call it a counterattack, an offensive act, or what have you. You know, it's not a static environment, so it's not as though, you know, we were attacked. And by the way, the we needs to be defined, right? But then we act and it's over. Okay, good. Well, we got them back, and now we can move on. It's a very dynamic process, and I think, what does it mean for things to start to scale up, where one acts, reaction, and then there are further actions and reactions, and what does that mean? What are the consequences? Do we create a greater harm? Do we not? What are the alternatives? I think it's a very case-specific inquiry, and I think that is being mapped as we speak. I don't have a clear answer, because I don't think there's necessarily clarity, nor do I necessarily think there should be. In other words, it's not formulaic. I think we have to have the space to make very case-specific decisions.
But I mean, that doesn't impose an awfully high cost, right? I mean, to some degree, especially with attacks being so routine, the decision-making process needs itself to become routine, or every time there's an attack, it doesn't cost them much, but it costs us a lot. But I guess that gets to the National Cyber Incident Response Framework that you've just looked to the HSAC.
That's right, and I think there should be are criteria that we use to develop the proper responses. It's not as though we don't have foundational elements to analyze in making the decision.
Yeah, and because we've really gone. I mean, during my time at the White House at Homeland Security Council, we never had a single incident that came through. Then it was the NCRCG, the National Cyber Response Group. We didn't have a single incident that came through us where they said, we, the interagency, need to raise this to the president. Not a single one, 2003 to 2005. And that certainly was too low. But now, if anything, it seems like we've got deputy committees meeting that maybe meet too frequently.
Well,
not that you can.
No. Yeah, I won't. I mean, when you join the government, I think it'll be fair to say that all of you will feel like you meet too frequently. Period. Look, we just had the president of China visit, and there was a very significant announcement with respect to cyber norms, international cyber norms, and a commitment on the part of the Chinese not to steal intellectual property for commercial gain. That's at a presidential level. It's a very significant development.
Yeah, great. Okay, and here in the front, and so if you please wait for the mic, and please just a single question and ends in a question mark.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to, just add to that. My question is based on what you just said.
Yeah.
I mean, leading up to the meeting between the president and Obama, China and the United States, there was a lot of talk in the media about, some sort of an agreement against cyber warfare. Mm-hmm. Some sort of first use doctrine, limitation, and that just seemed to evaporate. And it came down to, I mean, there was nothing really that came out of that. I don't think there's any sort of, so that's my question. Is there any sort of, agreement or discussion about that between, Obama and the president of China? Or?
So I can't speak to the discussions, but China had previously committed to some of the international cyber norms. And they included cyber attacks writ large, and those are public. Those international cyber norms are publicly accessible. But the one that historically China had not agreed to or committed to publicly was this theft of intellectual property, which is a very, very significant step, and it was therefore a very significant achievement.
I think we were astounded in that how much got agreed to in that. Agreements on cybercrime, to restart to restart high-level discussions and begin new groups on commercial espionage, and discussions on the work from the UN group of government experts. I mean, I think it was one of those places where we really did see a lot more coming out of public policy than we would have really expected. I wouldn't mind following up on that, but I did see another question here, and then we'll go to my colleague Steve Belvin.
Justin Canfield, I'm a PhD student here at Columbia. So I had a question. You spoke earlier about remediation and mitigation, and how those are important areas. And I wondered if, especially in light of the current legislation before Congress, what your thoughts are on the role for cyber insurance.
We have an expert in the Department of Homeland Security on cyber insurance, and talk about a rapidly changing dynamic. I think traditionally more general clauses and policies were sought to be invoked for the coverage of cyber incidents, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I know there's a tremendous amount of activity in the development of insurance policies, clauses specific to cyber threats, what harms are covered, and what is the scope of the coverage. It's an area with which I'm not sufficiently familiar to talk about, but I know it's very much a subject of discourse. But you have a follow-up, though.
I wanted to get your thoughts on whether insurance companies should be a middleman between the government and private sector, or whether that's chiefly a role for the government.
In what respect? I'm sorry.
In liability reduction.
Liability protection of the private sector. So
I've got a little bit. I mean, because I've done a lot of work with Zurich Insurance Group and with the other insurers, and we've got a huge misbalance, I'm not sure if that's a word, between the expectations of the insurance industry. You know, we look at, when we make our analogies, you know, we go to fire codes, and we go to driving, and we go to the role that insurance has played to, you know, managing risk in those areas. And that risk transfer role of insurance companies and reinsurers, it just seems so natural. But we've only got something like $3 billion in coverage written to this point, which sounds big, you know, especially if you've got college debt, you know, I mean, or maybe it doesn't seem that big compared to your college debt right now. But when you're actually in the world of the insured, I mean, this is considered specialty coverage. It's actually quite low. Quite low. And so we've got this misbalance between what we think insurance might do versus the premiums that we've got right now, and the role that risk management can play, and the ability of those insurance companies to really risk manage in the way and measure, and they can in other areas that are maybe a little bit more quantifiable. So I think it's still going to be a while for us to, and I would do the shout out to Tom Finan, who is who's done some fine work.
Yeah. So let me, if I can, add to that. So because I want to just mention something about liability. So what we've done is we have promulgated a framework, the NIST framework, that provides sort of an analytical architecture for companies to use to understand what criteria they should be looking at as they develop their cyber defenses. Okay, it's a framework. It's not a standard of care, but it gives a company or an entity the criteria to review and to analyze in developing its architecture. Our role is to, I think, is to provide that framework and to see that framework mature. And we are also, I think it is very much our role, and this is in the Department of Homeland Security, to one of Jay's earlier questions, to share information of which we are aware so that the public has greater knowledge of the cyber threat landscape and can strengthen itself. And then insurance companies, you know, handle the risk management, to use Jay's terminology. I will tell you that from the imposition of liability perspective, it's a very interesting landscape right now. And I say this as a former federal prosecutor. We see state attorneys general bring cases against companies, and even sometimes some federal regulatory, and certainly state regulatory agencies, bring actions against companies for inadequate cyber security. And it's just interesting to see these cases brought, and the courtroom is used for the imposition of liability before, I think, a standard of care is well defined or even adequately defined. And I'm not exactly sure I agree, and when I say I'm not sure, I actually mean that literally. It's something I'm, you know, looking at and considering. Is that the best way to create a standard of care through accountability mechanisms like that, rather than education and incentives? That's an odd incentive framework.
And I've been very pleased to see the FTC, the FCC, the SEC start to get involved, and you're starting to see more public policy, more,
yes,
and share this around to help go through that. And Justin, and for my students that are here and faculty, after my class this week, we're going to be having someone from Zurich Insurance Group come by, Catherine Mulligan, and we'll be talking through cyber insurance. And we can have some of these questions. So I'll send a notification out to faculty, and we can talk afterwards. And I'm checking my phone because I'm keeping an eye on the tweet feeds from our friends at Christian Science Monitor Passcode, hashtag CyberSIPA. If you are following online, please go ahead and ask questions. I'll try. I'm going to try and keep an eye on that in case we have questions over Twitter. But now I'm very, very honored to have the mic passed to my colleague, Steve Belevin.
So I'm a Steve Belevin, computer science professor here, and I've had a fair amount of entanglement with the government, in particular with DHS, over the last 10 years. So given the vagaries of budget and partisan involvements in budget, given civil service pay scales, what can DHS do to raise the level of, I'll say security, I'll also say competence, the government's IT workforce, IT infrastructure, and so on? It is not nearly as good as it should be. What should DHS be doing, given that part of DHS's role, I was told, is to protect .gov while NSA protects .mil?
Yes. So that's right. So the Department of Homeland Security, we are responsible for the we're in the lead for raising the cybersecurity of the .gov space. So a few things. One, in terms of the recruitment of talent, Congress last year passed legislation that gave us greater pay flexibility. That doesn't mean that we can compete with Goldman Sachs in terms of pay, but I would say we can compete with anyone and win in terms of sense of fulfillment. And so if we can, that speaks, you're hearing someone speak who tragically, his sense of fulfillment is inversely proportional to his income. It seems the less I make, the happier I am. But be that as it may.
Come to academia, you are going to be ecstatic.
So I think we have greater pay flexibility. We also have the attraction of individuals who want to serve the public good. We've also been given authorities to assist in, I think compelling is too strong a word, I would say driving other government agencies to adopt best practices. And in fact, a case in point is our Secretary issued the first operational directive to government agencies to drive certain standard of behavior within them. So I think we're at an early, at a relatively early stage, but we're driving behavior within the government, and I think we are recruiting great talent. Two such great talents are in the back of the room, and Jeanette Manfra and Rob Silvers.
And
they're each getting paid $1.2 million.
Right. And I think it's interesting in the role that DHS plays with academia. I mean, DHS Science and Technology has done fantastic work in this area. Doug Maughan in BGPSec, DNSSec, and a lot of others. After the very first class I had here, we had DHS INA, the intelligence part, came and talked about the internship program and how to get hired. And so we know about the Cyber Corps Scholarship for Service, with scholarships from DHS and DoD and others on to bring in grads. And so I'm just curious your thoughts on that, on what kind of grads you need, especially public policy and international affairs, but of course also computer security and the rest. What can we do more to help?
I think that what you can do quite specifically is expose individuals to the work that we do and the possibility of working not only in the government, I think, but importantly, two examples here with the government. I will tell you. So I think that exposure, raising students' awareness of the career paths of public service, and there are very many different ways to serve the public. One can be in the government, one can be in academia, one can work with the government, as Jeff does, as one of our critical advisors. I think that's probably a best example. And by the way, the skills one needs depends upon the job one most wants to do. Because one can be a really exceptional thinker and have a very significant footprint in the development of policy. And in this space, also the development of operations. One can be a tech expert and then have a more of an one can be involved in policy, of course, but one can perhaps have a more operational role. You know, we have an emergency response team that travels around the country and responds to cyber incidents, and they're amongst the best in the world. And so I just think the opportunities are endless and endlessly fascinating.
Great. I'm gonna ask you. Can you give the mic to Jeanette Manfra in the back there for a second? In the back. Jeanette, what was your academic background?
Wow,
By the way, when I said she was paid $1.2 million, I meant that spiritually.
Yeah. What was your academic background?
I have a bachelor's in history and a master's in international security.
Yeah, great. That's what I was thinking. You know, so you did come into this from the kinds of students that, for example, we produce here at SIPA, and you know, your DHS and the White House, and now getting to travel around with the Deputy Secretary as counselor. So a great example, and I think that's one of the great ways that one of the things that we can do in for example, public policy schools is there's not a lot of women are necessarily in the field of cybersecurity yet, and I think that's one good way that we can help make the field more diverse. Okay, we have over here the gentleman on the end. Good.
By the way, if I may, Jeanette Manfra, one of the most prominent experts in cybersecurity in our department and in the government, are the office within the Department of Homeland Security that NPPD, National Programs Protection Directorate, its name will hopefully be changed in the near future, is led by Suzanne Spalding, and the number 2 person in that office is Phyllis Schneck.
Yeah. And, okay, sir. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Greg Gist. I actually work in the private sector for the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center.
Oh, great.
My question to you regards the public-private partnership.
Yeah.
The basic tenet of the public-private partnership is that no one side has all the answers or all the resources to solve a particular problem, either on the physical incident side or the cyber incident side. What is on your wish list for the public-private partnership that we can engage or collaborate on that you don't see happening right now?
You know, the first thing that comes to mind would be we need more proselytizers for the sharing of information. It goes back to my point earlier of a trust divide. I think the financial services industry is extremely mature in sharing information within its sector, and also with the government, and an exchange of information. There are other sectors that are similarly mature, but that is not widespread enough. I think the sharing of information is one of our greatest areas of focus, and communicating the compelling need and the benefits of doing so is something that needs to spread throughout the private sector.
And my own background was FSISAC, so I was vice chairman of the FSISAC back in not long after 9/11. And what especially like recently about the what I liked then about the FSISAC model that predated me was how much it was built on trust, and it was started on interpersonal trust. You know, we thought that we could start with sharing anonymous data sets, and so the conversations were, well, what fields will we share with one another? And we weren't ready for it yet because we didn't have the trust. And we built up that trust through long hours spent together, a fair amount of margaritas, and we got to that point probably in the mid-2000s where we could start talking about things like Soltra and build this. And what I really and we thought sharing had to be anonymous, and it just didn't. Once we had built up that trust, and that extended to DHS. We had some folks in the public office than the private sector office. There are guys like Kevin McCrowan that once we got to know, it was easy to bring them in.
And then experience.
Exactly,
and
right,
then experience, the experience of sharing and reaping the benefit.
And especially what I like now with the FSISAC has been expanding out, taking that expertise and sharing it into, for example, law firms, and saying, good, we need law firm security to improve, we'll do that, and also cross borders. Because we always say the internet is inherently international, the solutions must be international, and then every country sets up national sharing mechanisms. And with the FSISAC extending into Europe and to Asia, I think we're really seeing us get back to it.
And an ISAC is an information sharing and analysis center. Is that the
Correct?
Yeah, where people in a particular sector of industry will share information amongst themselves to raise the bar. You know, the question that comes to mind is, so law firms, you know, are developing that same ISAC model. Do universities have them? I don't know. I wonder if they do and how secure this university's cyber system is. It's interesting.
Yeah. Please don't tempt anyone to try. So, thank you.
By the way, if I may, at DEF CON, I was advised, and I followed this advice, not to bring my BlackBerry. Now I've matured in my device, but to bring my BlackBerry or my iPhone to the conference, to even enter the hotel with it on or off, because they were vulnerable to hacking. I just find it, I find it fascinating from a talent perspective that people are so skilled.
Yep. Great. And so I wanted to get, I'm going to look around one last set for questions here and see if there's any last questions. Okay, there's one over here. And while the mic is coming over, I wanted to thank Ingrid from the Saltzman Institute for helping put this together. We have Aristu and Fabrice that I'm bringing around the microphone, so thank you for that. I also wanted to thank, again, Passcode for live streaming this, and Sarah Sorcher and David Grant for the tweets. Sir.
Hi, my name is Sherman. I'm a first-year student here at SIPA. So my question is regarding collaboration with other friendly nations and even NATO members. To what degree are we collaborating with them, and also how much info sharing is going on right now between us and friendly nations?
Obviously it's a function of the relationship between the countries, but we share information quite robustly. With quite a number of nations, understanding that there's a shared interest and, quite frankly, a shared threat. It also depends on the nature of the information and its level of sensitivity, if you will, or security, and that helps define the parameters of our sharing protocols. So we have some partners that are extraordinarily close, and we share information quite a bit, and we have others where we'll share at a different level, and we have others where we're at an arm's length. It's a very dynamic landscape.
And I'd like your international affairs shop to be pretty much full of SIPA within a couple of years. But it is interesting in the places that you'd see the DHS folks. I mean, there's been a very long-standing set of bilateral agreements with the Japanese. I'd say for probably a good 10 years. I would be on the track 1.5 with China, and we'd see Krista Russia from NPPD and from the front office that was always there. And folks that are coming in largely with international affairs backgrounds. Chris spoke Putonghua. I mean, that was why he was there. And it was interesting to see these regional specialists that really, that were able to take that specialization, get some cyber on them, and really represent the agency well. I'm sorry, the department well. So the last question is, so I know when Jeff and I talk, we talk about what's our favorite hacking movies or the most accurate cybersecurity movies. But so I want to ask, for favorite Homeland Security movies or shows. I mean, when you're watching something, when you say, oh man, they just got it right. And or I don't want. Yeah. So what are the ones that you think really get it right and represent DHS or Homeland Security well overall?
So
I will come in, did
yeah.
you?
So I will tell you that every morning I wake up to a barrage of emails, and the sad thing is that most of those emails are actually from me to me, reminding me of the things I have to do in the day. So the most realistic movie is the one I play in my head about the day ahead of me.
Yeah.
My wife loves Homeland. I am working to love it because it's really, I find it heavy. I find it really, really heavy. Not just heavy from a national security perspective, but heavy from like an interpersonal perspective, the family dynamic and everything. It's just it's too much for me. Their vocabulary is, I think, very good. I think it's very, very good. I mean, the vocabulary in speaking of the issues that we ourselves tackle. So that's the one that comes to mind. It's probably the only show that I watch regularly anyhow.
Well, you did leave yourself open for this. So if that's too heavy, then what do you like to lighten up to? Three Stooges?
I wrestle with my 10-year-old every Saturday morning. We have a wrestling match every Saturday morning.
Perfect.
Monday morning, I'm in the orthopedist, and
How often do you win?
I would say that's the lightest thing I do.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Please give really thank for this wonderful back and forth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just in closing, you're almost never going to see this, where a senior administration official is willing to do a back and forth for the entire time and not hide behind the podium. And so we really do appreciate this, and hopefully we'll live up to your expectations with questions and answers. Great.
Thanks
Thank you
very much.
Cheers.
Thank you, Chair. Really terrific.